sometimes will paint from the imagination, but that has been more of a recent development. I'm typically working off of an image on a screen. These are typically images I took myself, which I try to lean towards. I will say, even though I feel like I'm happy with the compositions in my paintings, I'm not actually that great of a photographer, so I usually let myself down in that regard. But every once in a while, I do work off of my own images. When it's not my own image, it's an image a friend took, or my fiance's mom is an amazing photographer just on her phone. I steal her images off of Facebook all the time. She goes to national parks, and I just say, do you mind if I just paint, this nice picture you took? She doesn't mind at all. And then occasionally I find like a hobbyist photographer on social media, and I link up with them. I always try to ask permission before I take somebody else's image. I don't like going on Pinterest or Google Images and just finding something random. It's nice to find something that either you took yourself or you have some sort of connection to where the image came from. Because you typically get people asking, oh, where is this painting from? And it's good to have that information on hand when you get those questions. But I work off of my computer screen. Another handy thing about that is that it's very easy that way to, if I ever want to work off of like a grid transfer, very easy to just sort of apply that through a quick Google search. There's so many programs that will help you with setting up grids on the screen and then transferring that onto your canvas. But this is the image that we're going to be working off of today. If you're wondering where this is located, this is a photo from near Lake Ontario. I'm originally from Rochester, New York, so grew up right near the lake. So this is a little fall scene from up there. I figured that would be a straightforward image to approach. No, nothing precise, no straight lines. We'll just get straight into what that looks like. So the first step that I take in my images, actually before I even get into that, I will say priming the canvas is a huge, huge, huge piece of what makes my acrylic painting process so much more enjoyable. I prime my canvases by first sanding them down, and then a typical primer a lot of people use is just white gesso. It's a very common thing that people reach for with prepping canvases. I do mine a little bit differently, where I mix together white liquid gesso with what's called a modeling paste, heavy modeling paste. It's similar to gesso, but it's just a little bit thicker. And I mix those two ingredients together at about a 50-50 ratio. After I've sanded down my canvas, I apply a fairly thin but even coat of that all over the canvas. Smooth it out with a wet paper towel, let it dry. Sand, once it's perfectly touch dry, sand a little more time and repeat. Repeat that whole process 2 times. And then once that's totally dry,
what grade sand?
I think I should have brought my sandpaper with me. I think it was a 120. Is it? Oh, okay. I was just, honestly, I went to Lowe's and just grabbed what looked right.
I don't know about canvas, but it's probably.
Oh, is it? Okay. Well, hopefully it's right for canvas. But yeah, I do use a 120. Mix the modeling piece and the gesso together. And what that does for you, if you guys want to give it, like, you can go ahead and touch the surface of that. It gives you a very, very nice, smooth, like eggshell finish to it. Yeah, so it feels a lot nicer than this one that feels when it's all done. Yeah, it's just a much more pleasant surface to work off of. I would say even if you didn't use anything, prime it with anything at all, just at the very least sanding your canvas goes such a long way. If you're buying commercial canvas from Michael's or Blick or any art store, it goes such a long way in just the process being so much more enjoyable, I would say. But once that's all dry, I got a nice smooth canvas. Now there are surfaces that, of course, you can buy that are already sort of like that. There's gesso board, there's clay board. Those are common in terms of options for things that feel very similar to this. But if you're somebody that doesn't want to let go of like that feel of just like having a canvas, if somebody's purchasing a piece, a lot of people just like a canvas, a nice wood board to the back. If you don't want to give up that three-dimensional feel of canvas, but you want a smoother surface, that is something I recommend. All right, now once that's dry, I go in and I start with a sketch of my initial scene. Now, I'm not somebody who goes into my scenes with a lot of concern over precision. I don't like to get too caught up in realism. I think that, for me personally, kind of takes the fun out of it a little bit, being that I'm kind of a recovering perfectionist. I try not to, yeah, it really took the fun out of it for a long time, so I try really hard to not, like, perfectly one-to-one replicate my photo references. I let that be, a guide for what I want to do, and then I'm trying to reinterpret it onto the canvas. So what I typically do...
Chelsea,
yeah.
can I just suggest that you turn it so we can see the image you're going to
Oh, yeah, sure.
work on? It helps.
Of course. Yeah, I'll turn that a bit. I'll do my best to reposition myself as I'm working so everybody can see everything. Hopefully I will not spill these cups. Actually, come over here. Move the head back here a lot down. All right. So, I use colored pencils to prepare my sketch. The reason I use two different colors will kind of become clear as I continue working. I'll jump ahead and say that I do use an underpainting wash, like a solid color, as my starting backdrop. So that's where these two color choices come into play. My underpainting wash is a warm orange color, kind of an orangish scarlet red. So my initial sketch is going to be in a colored pencil that will easily disappear under that wash. And once I have finished my initial sketch, I go back in with a complementary color that I'll still be able to view under the wash. So that saved me from the kind of alternative option of using like a traditional graphite pencil, where you could sketch it out. I've always struggled with erasing and not leaving myself with a huge smudge on canvas. It kind of tends to give me that issue. So this is sort of my workaround for erasing any, undesired lines in my initial sketch. And again, I'm just very general in terms of my placement. This is definitely a lot more important if I'm working on something a little bit more precise. I just sort of map out my composition very, very generally. And if there's something I'm not quite happy with this orange line, that's where I will make my adjustments. But again, I'm really just looking to establish my major landmarks and my composition. I'm not trying to be too precise. So just deciding on where this little blob of lily pads is going to go. So again, very, very general, just putting down major landmarks. These leaves in the foreground, mapped up here. And as I paint, that's where I'll worry about maybe making my details a little bit more precise. So if I've made any mistakes, it all occurs with this first color pencil, the orange color pencil. Once I feel like I'm okay with how things are placed, that's where I will go in and make a final mark. Where all of these different elements are going to end up. There are a lot of artists I follow on social media who I think are a little bit more precise in this step. And there are times where I do give a little more precision, like if there's ever an architectural element in my piece, I will definitely take a little bit more time to try to make sure I get the perspective on that correct. But just as long as I got my major elements in there, that's really all I'm concerned about. So I'll put the leaves over there. And major groupings of lily pads. Even with architectural elements like houses or anything of that nature, and which do sometimes make an appearance in my paintings, I like to do suburban scenes and things like that. I still try to keep things generally loose, But just still having that perspective and making sure your lines aren't getting all wonky as you paint can be really helpful in giving you just a little bit of structure. For the most part, I'm probably going to mess around with these elements and not be too precise as I start to paint. So this is about how far I would get. I have like a couple tree trunks that I want to make sure I pay attention to once I get my painting down. I was going to ask before I got started, do you guys have a paper plate that I can use real quick? That would actually be helpful for my underpainting layer. Colors. All right, so the underpainting, which I think maybe is also sometimes considered just like your wash. I know underpainting can kind of take two different definitions. The way I've been seeing it more recently is with people describing a solid background color that they start painting off of. That's one way to think of underpainting. I know more commonly in like oil painting, and underpainting can also take the form of like that sketch that you work off of that's also monochromatic and you build on top of it. So when I say underpainting, I'm just talking about a wash background layer. And I use a mixture of two different acrylic pigments. These are both of the quinacridone family. I use quinacridone magenta and I use quinacridone nickel azo gold. And I use these more or less 50-50 ratio mixed together. And that's how I end up with the sort of scarlet color I get in my background every time. Now, once I squirt a little bit of this down, I also sometimes like to make it a little bit, flow a little bit nicer and have a little bit more transparency by adding a medium. I use Liquitex satin medium very, very often. I often use this in place of watering down my paints in general. But I'll add a little bit of that into those colors. And of course I forgot my large paintbrush, so this guy will have to do for me right now. But I'll mix these two together very loosely. And keep my brush wet as well. And I just want to make sure that this is just going to be a nice wash. So this color is where you will see any of my initial sketch, those orange lines, totally disappear. So if I made any mistakes that I didn't want in my final iteration of my under sketch, these will all just be masked right out with this underpainting layer.
Better about those.
And I will only see my blue sketch lines once this is all said and done. All that requires. Hopefully they'll not disable Alright, so that is what I typically start with, and I get the most questions, I think, when I post my work and my painting processes a lot on different social media platforms, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, things like that. And the most common question myself and any other artist who uses this type of step gets is, what is the point of this red color or any other color that you may be using, especially if you're covering it all up. So if you've never used an underpainting, there's a couple of different purposes behind this. One, it's just a lot easier to nail your hues and your values when you're not working off of a pure white background. Sort of breaking that up with something that is sort of in the medium value range in terms of whatever color it is you choose. Most commonly, I think, especially with oil painters, you'll see people use something warm in general, and usually more on like a natural like tone in terms of the hue that they choose. It's usually like a burnt umber or a burnt sienna is a more common base that people will put down. That's a lot easier to work off of if you have less of a strong hue. So for people who are looking for Something a little less, I would say, stylized. I would say going for something like a burnt umber or a burnt sienna wash as your background color is going to be a lot more of a safe and more standard choice for your underpainting. But if you're looking for something a little bit more stylized, which I tend to do in my work, is I will pick a bright color. And in terms of what color to choose, it's really up to your own personal preference and what you want to get out of your finished result. My preference is for really bold colors in my end results, and I prefer the way the warmth of this underpainting pulls through in the end. I like there to be overall infusion of like a warm hue to the entire scene. It just gives it a very different feel than if I was to use like a bold teal or something along those lines. The end result is just going to look a lot different. But another benefit to putting down any sort of wash, regardless of the color, is that no matter the quality of your paint supplies, whether it's the most high quality, heavy body acrylic paint or heavy oil paint, no matter what, your end result is not going to be perfectly opaque. So there's always going to be a little bit of light getting through your pigments. If you were to shine a light, behind your canvas, you would see how light's getting through, and that opacity isn't as perfectly sealed as you maybe thought it was from on the surface level looking at it. So having this additional layer of color to start off of, it brings you up to a higher level of opacity than you would get just working off of just solid white canvas. And because those paints are never perfectly opaque, you're getting a little extra flavor of a different color kind of coming through any gaps in the opacity of your actual painting application. So this sort of adds an extra layer of opacity and just a color depth to the finished result. It would just look a lot different than painting straight on white. All right, so we're going to let that dry just a little bit longer. I will talk about my paints. So as you saw, I was using golden acrylics is my typical go-to. This is just their fluid acrylic. I have a lot of these on hand and I'm trying to use them up, so that's what I'm using for my background color. But I do use primarily golden heavy body acrylics. I sometimes will replenish with some Liquitex heavy body just to save some money. Every once in a while the sticker shock is just too much and I'll go for the Liquitex. It's just, especially with my titanium white, I'll just do Liquitex, what's the difference, I guess, right? But mostly golden, heavy body, and I set my colors up on probably my absolute favorite of all of my art supplies is my wet palette. This was such a huge game changer for me in my paintings. So if you are an acrylic artist, there is definitely a lot of benefit to the fact that acrylics dry so fast. Obviously, sometimes you do want things to not be sitting wet forever. I have tried oils recently, and it's definitely a shift to Masterson's. I know you probably can't see that very well because it's just a 3D thing on there, but it's Masterson's Stay Wet Handy Palette. Comes in at least 2 sizes. This is the smallest size I think they do. It's a slightly bigger one. And what it is that it has a special type of palette paper that you soak and get nice and wet. And underneath it, you've got a slightly damp little sponge sitting right under there. It takes a little bit of, I'm going to say, troubleshooting to figure out just how damp to leave that. But you get that guy damp, you let the palette paper soak for 15 minutes, or allegedly you can nuke it in the microwave. I haven't tried that. But you just let that paper soak, you set up your palette, you do your painting, and when you're done for the day, you just seal this guy right back up. I know they are not sponsoring me, but they should. This is all free advertisement for Masterson's, because I love this thing so much. It's literally life-changing as an acrylic artist. But you seal that up. The 2 main benefits there are, if you're a busy person or you don't have a lot of motivation to paint, You don't have to set up every single time and clean up every single time. You just open your paints up when you're ready to sit down again and get back to work. When it's pretty much all used up, I think you can, I think I've let these sit for 2 weeks and they stay wet the whole time. No issues with it at all. And the only drawback is that you do have to watch out. It does run the risk of getting growing a little bit of mold. I haven't had that happen in a long time. I think what caused it to get moldy was that I tried to wash the sponge with soap. So don't do that, and don't put it in your fridge. It doesn't need to like be in a more humid environment. It'll stay damp in there for 2 weeks. Some people have left it in there longer, and it just makes it a big game changer in terms of not having to clean up, and it also obviously keeps your palette damp longer while you're working. I don't have to worry about like making sure I'm working for as long as I can before my palette gets all crusty on me. It'll stay wet throughout, you know, hours of painting. And when you're making your color mixes as you're working, your color mixtures, you can go back to it. It won't have dried up on you, on your palette, whatever you mixed up for your water. If you need to go back to that color, chances are it's still pretty wet on there. So that's very handy for that reason too. Again, I also like to use medium to re-wet things if they do dry up, because it's not foolproof. It will kind of get a little dry every once in a while. I do highly recommend using a medium. There's so many different uses for mediums, but primarily what I'm using a medium for is reactivating my paints when they do dry out. I find that I don't like to turn to more water in my acrylics. It weakens the pigment. It accelerates that pesky issue with acrylics where they tend to dry down darker than what you put them down as on your canvas. More water will make that a little bit more working for you. So using a medium, that's something that I will turn to a lot in my process too. All right, I think this is mostly dry. Again, that's the handy thing. Even when I'm doing my oil paintings, I'll use my acrylics for my underpainting. Just dries so much faster. So the way I would approach any of my scenes, any of my landscapes, is that I attempt to force myself to start as big as I can with my brushes, and just focus on putting down general planes of color and value, and then slowly working my way down to smaller and smaller details. Another thing that you will notice about my methods is that I tend to work front to back. I like to do my sky last, my background color last. There's a couple of reasons for that. The main one being I'm trying to keep as many of these elements in direct contact with that underpainting color as possible. I don't want to put a wash of blue back here and then have, you know, some of my trees interacting with a blue background and some of it interacting with a red background. I want to treat it like a puzzle that I'm piecing together. So I like to have my sky go down last as its own thing. Another little tidbit that I'll throw in here in terms of color mixing. I'm happy to talk about more detail into my color palette choices. It's pretty much the same colors every single time, based on some experimenting with color mixing back in my first true year of painting in 2021 or so. I did a lot of experimenting with my color mixing, and this is the palette I pretty much have landed on. Sometimes I'll have a phthalo in there, sometimes I won't. Sometimes this is cerulean instead of cobalt, but for the most part, it's the same thing every time. The one paint pigment I do not own, and I probably never will, unless I'm experimenting with green or something like that. I don't have any black on my palette. I don't like to use it. I know there's a lot of other people that maybe went to art school. I see a head nodding. I don't like black paint, unless, like, I think there's some creative color mixes you can do. I see people like to mix it with yellow to make an interesting green. But one of the things I try to teach people who are trying to more seriously learn acrylics is that if you are trying to create value, black is not your friend at all. I think there are some people who enjoy it, enjoy the effect that it has, and the fact that it like kind of can tend to desaturate and muddy things a little bit, and maybe that, you know, it works for some people. But the way I keep my colors as vibrant as I do is by avoiding black. And so I create what's called a chromatic black using burnt umber and an ultramarine blue. I mix those two together in varying levels. It just depends on what I'm trying to mix up. Sometimes it's more of a blue black, sometimes it's more of a brown black, it just depends. But mixing those two together is my favorite way to create darker shades. Okay, so what I'll do to start out is pick out some of my bigger areas, and I also try to focus on my darker values first. I don't count on trying to get it right the first time. I'm just trying to get as close as I can. So right now I'm trying to mix up this dark bluish green color that I see down here in my reflection. I'll start with a mix of brown, my burnt umber, and my ultramarine blue. Mix those together as my dark base, and then I'm going to try to make this sort of a bluish green color to begin, using a little cobalt and a little cadmium yellow. I don't remember if it's light or medium. I think I have medium in mind, which is, yeah, probably. So I'll mix those together to get a very subdued green, getting as close as I can to trying to match that. It looks pretty good so far. And then we're just focusing on putting things down as broadly as possible, not worrying just yet about precision. And worry about all the details as I go on later. I'll work a little bit around where I was trying to put those lily pads, but I'm very, very big if I put things down initially. And I'm also not worrying just yet about how much this color changes. Obviously it's not maybe all the same color. There's a little bit of a shift where it's like, you know, it's a little darker here, and then it's a little lighter and a little bit more yellow in this strip in the reflection of the water. I'm not worrying about that just yet. I'll worry about those little nuances in this part after it's dried a little bit. I'm just establishing the local zones for each major focal point in the painting. So I'll put all that down. I'll worry about getting those other details a little bit later. That's where I'll start, and maybe I'll try to find some of these darker shades in here. Now, when I'm going to go try to tackle this shadowy area in the trees back here, I'm trying to pay a little closer attention to leaving the surface area for this tree in the foreground as untouched as I can at this stage. Again, I'm not the most precise artist. I'm very, again, I'll slap things down at this stage. But one place I will try to be a little bit more rigid and specific is where I have bright yellows and bright oranges, and sometimes reds that lean a little bit more on the orange spectrum too. The reason for that is that things in the yellow-orange family, I have learned like to absorb whatever is underneath them. So that would mean that if I put down this dark shade and I'm a little more careful with where I place it, and I don't leave enough bare canvas and underpainting for where the yellow leaves are going to go, I'm going to have a slightly harder time getting a punchier yellow, because it likes to absorb whatever is underneath it. You get too many dark values underneath your yellow, and you're going to start to find that you're not getting it as vibrant as you would initially. One of the things I also do, that maybe I could have done here too, is if I'm really concerned concerned with getting a light source or a light, like bright value or color in my scene as bright as possible. Is with this underpainting, what I also could have done is take a wet or damp paper towel and I can sort of just like wipe away a little bit of my underpainting, just so it's a little bit less strong, maybe in this area right here where there's this brighter greenish yellow. That way, if I'm really concerned with the red kind of pulling away from that bright yellow spot, I can just take away a little bit of that and sort of mark out where my highlights are going to go and to not worry about any colors interfering with those. So I'm going to go a little bit darker. I'm probably just going to I tend to continue to like mix over my previous color mixes often. Unless it like absolutely calls for it. For the most part, I want to say 50% of the time I am just creating a new color mix, bouncing right off of whatever my previous color mix was. I think that lends to a lot of color harmony in your finished result. You notice when I am teaching my art class at the Poster Art Center, and that's my intro to acrylics. So all absolute beginners, a lot of people that have never used acrylic before, maybe they've done a little bit of craft paint, things of that nature. For the most part, I've never touched acrylics. I will often encourage them as they're playing around with their color mixes, don't feel like you have to jump to a completely new spot on your palette to create another mix. You can always see if maybe you need to incorporate something you mixed for another area in your scene, see if that can come into play in this new color mix you're creating. See how they kind of all work together. This would be my shade in here, my darkest shade. Pull it a little darker. And just put in the shadow back here. Again, trying to leave space for this bright yellow patch in my trees right there. Always harping on. And I think it goes for both of the types of classes I teach, the more traditional art classes at the art store, and also my very casual art classes at the Paint and Sip business in Lexington. That no matter where you are in your art journey, whether you're doing it for fun at a Paint and Sip class or you're a professional, you have to trust the process through these very, very ugly first stages. When I first started painting again, I would get to something like this and I'd be like, okay, what am I doing? What is going on here? This looks terrible. But now I kind of can see past it. I've done this enough times where I know, yes, this looks like nothing right now, but the more you play around with it, the closer, you end up getting to a result that you're happy with, just as long as you kind of keep seeing this initial stage for what it is. All right, I'm going to make sure I get this foreground element plotted in the best that I can now, so I don't have to worry about it anymore. So I need to mix up a lighter green. I'm just going to take some yellow and keep playing around with mixtures that I've already got going on my palette. And again, even though these are smaller leaves, there's a little bit more of a crisper detail to this being a foreground element. I'm still not ready to downsize in my brush just yet, because I don't want to get too caught up in details. At this stage, I just want to plot things in. Maybe I'll use the corner of my brush to sort of get a little bit of a foliage look to it. But that is another pitfall. I don't know how many other artists also find that maybe they get a little too caught up on the details too soon in your piece. And there are also some artists who, whether you're like a portrait artist or a landscape artist, that they can take one section of their piece, say they're working on this tree, and they complete that to like precise, all the details, all the way done, and then they move on to the next section. I don't know how to do that. I feel like I need to see everything in comparison to each other to kind of call them each done. Use like, how they look relative to one another to know that I got my values absolutely correct or something like that. So that's not something that I've ever really dabbled in, but I like to keep it as broad across the entire scene as I possibly can before I allow myself to start thinking about smaller details. So I've got a couple of darker leaves, so I'll transition in my mix here. You can see I've kind of got a nice spectrum going in terms of a lighter green, and I'm working up in that darker shade that I already had mixed. Give myself a darker green again. Just keep blobbing that on there. And I'll worry about making adjustments to it later on. Now I know we won't see a fully completed piece tonight, but I want to try to see if I can get somewhere I can show you guys how I do my skies. I'm obviously not the only person who works this way. I'm sure there's a lot of people that are similar. But once I'm finished with something like this section where I have, some foliage all completed, it won't be until, like I said, the very end of things where I will start to throw in my sky. And I like to use more of a subtractive method to put my sky in. I'll get these leaves completely done, mix up my blue, and I'll start to poke in these little light sources later on to pull my sky back forward. And it also allows you to play around with the shape of your leaves and your foliage a little bit more. For some reason, I'm never fully satisfied with how I render leaves and trees to whatever level of detail. I'm never quite happy with it, just doing it freehand with my paintbrush. Something about kind of the added element of carving it back out with the sky behind it, the color of the sky. It just adds a quality to the rendering of my leaves that I couldn't get necessarily, at least I don't think I could, without that method. I'm just focusing on placement for right now. I'll worry about more minute changes later on. So I think at this stage of having those leaves blocked in is probably where I will try to start plotting in my, get this guy out of here, my brighter greens and yellows, just to make sure I don't lose space for those guys. I'll put those down a little bit sooner. And yes, these are the exact cups. I've literally been using these things since 2021. I stole this from my younger brother. I just figured, why ruin another cup? We'll keep using Yoga as my storage here. phthalo green in there is kind of a newer choice for me. I used to not really have any greens on my palette. I usually just mix things up without it, but I'm trying out phthalo green. Another thing I try to recommend to when I'm teaching my beginner class, I try to recommend that people play around with a limited palette as they're learning their colors. I find that really, like I know when I first started trying to paint again, I would look at my reference image and I would think, oh, I'm drawing the Grand Canyons and I need this reddish brown, so I'll use this burnt sienna or something like that. Just not even thinking about how I need to mix my colors together as opposed to looking for a tube that already looks just like the color I'm looking for or working towards. And one of my most, I think, enjoyable class sessions has been when I started to try to teach people color mixing with a limited palette. You can just pick your 3 primaries, whatever iteration of those you may want. Could be a very straightforward one like your cadmium red, yellow, and ultramarine blue, and white, and stone black, and trying to replicate a scene with just those colors, and seeing how close you can get, and then adding in whatever else you think might be necessary based on that experiment. What could you achieve? But green is a new thing for me, actually, like having that on there. I usually will just mix it up. There are certain complementary colors I've personally given up on trying to mix the way I want. That's why I always keep this, I don't know if I'm ever pronouncing it right, pyroli or pyrol orange, a nice bright orange. I have yet to really achieve the kind of orange that I really like from mixing different shades of, or different hues or pigments of yellow and red together. So there are some oranges and some purples that I'll have a tube handy for those types of things. Because you do learn that there are some colors that are nearly impossible to truly mix together, that you need a tube visually look closer. Actually, here. I'm just getting through there so far. Here, in the middle, just a second. Just to identify all of those little bright highlighted areas. Keep those mapped out. In a lot of ways, I almost feel like these initial layers are still kind of an underpainting on their own too. The quality is very, very shoddy looking. It's nothing to hang up in a gallery as it is. But it's so important to keep working through this initial uglier phase before you start to focus on beautifying it. Keep working in layers. That is the beauty of acrylic, and how fast it dries is how many chances for a new layer to get in just one sitting. I'm trying to get a couple different variations in green and yellow in that tree too. Dark still. I think maybe a little orange in there too. Not too much orange. Still working off of that same color pile, especially since I'm working on the same element as well. Darker yellow leaves in the somebody who's super specific at what I'm doing. I'm just going for an overall feeling with my brush strokes. I'm not trying to go for replication, perfect photo replication. I definitely admire people who do that. I'm sure I could if I applied myself to get more realism, but it's not right for my brain. I just don't think I should go down that path. I would beat myself up way too much. Fluid and blobby is a lot more fun. I think it's a lot more fun to see all the different blobs come together into something that makes sense. Like a lot of my finished pieces, maybe from far away, look like I have a lot of detail to them, but upon closer inspection, you can see just how almost abstract they really are, in my opinion. A little close, and you see all the messy brush strokes in there. Just keep working on the same little pin on.
How long does it normally take you to finish a painting?
It depends on the size and the subject matter. I want to say if I really apply myself, I can sit for about 4 to 5 hours a day. You know, getting up once in a while, of course. And then that, I think I could finish a painting in like 3 to 4 days. And probably because I don't go super heavy in my details. Bigger ones definitely take me a lot longer, or again, more details. Like the bigger the two, the orange flower field, took me a lot longer because there were so many small details in that field. But there are definitely some plainer pieces that did not take nearly as long. Where are we with time? It is almost 8. I think olive green, dark olive green, and now I've started to try to play with shifting my values a little bit, pushing certain chromatic elements in my color mixes to better reflect the actual reference image. But again, aside from trying to map out my bright yellows and oranges just to make sure I keep dedicated space for them, for the most part, I am somebody that likes to work in the general trend of dark to light. I don't kind of keep myself specifically shackled to that, but for the most part, it's dark to light. Once I've got a general attempt at getting as dark as I can, and then I'll make adjustments. So now that I've got a couple more colors in there, let's see, I gotta take a look a little bit closer at my reference. I'm gonna go a little bit smaller in my brush at this stage, not by much. What is this, considered like a 24, I think? Something along those lines. It says millimeters, so I can tell you, but I think it's a 24. And then maybe we'll shrink down to about half that. But still not letting myself get super, super small just yet. Another thing I like to talk about in my classes, again with beginners, is suggesting that people really experiment with a lot of different brush types. I know I was trying all different brush shapes when I was starting out, and I personally landed on almost exclusively using flat. It's for something about it, no matter what I'm painting, no matter how organic the shape is, a flat brush just feels a lot better to work with. They're also super handy for turning to with painting elements that are very long and broad. So long reeds of grass, or a long skinny tree branch or tree trunk that goes a long way. I have found that using that thin edge of my flat brush is a lot more instrumental and helpful for doing long lengths of something thin than something like a rigger brush or a small detail brush like this. If I am using a small detail brush like so, the longer the bristles, obviously the better for getting those long lengths. You just want, I just try to turn towards something that will hold a lot of paint. I don't have to constantly reload. You're not running out as you're making your mark. And I find that flat brushes are great for that purpose. So, with this slightly smaller flat brush, maybe I'll start to put in some of this medium to light blue in this area over here. Maybe get some of this marked in over here. Still not trying to let myself get too small in my details just yet. We're going to start to mix up some blues. Let's try to play around with that real quick. Let's see. And even though I'm kind of going the way of like making a completely new mix, I still don't start out a new mix super far away from where I was just working. Everything kind of turns into a big blended, interlinked mess on here. Let's see. I want to keep this blue slightly muted, so I'm going to lean on my burnt umber to desaturate it just a little bit. Start to mark some of that in there. That needs to go a little bit more like a aquatic blue. I need a little bit of this teal color. I love using teals. Teal is so instrumental in any of my waters and any of my sky. There's teal in a lot of it. Start to get some of these brighter blue elements coming in here. And I'll just layer over my previous application of that olive green, my water. And again, I'll return to this color in this section later on, once I get to a point where I'm ready to work on an even smaller and more detailed scale. I'll come back with a nice smaller brush, and I'll start to really, split hairs. I'm getting tinier little light effects on the broken surface of the water, but right now I'm still keeping it pretty general. Another thing that I try to do, and again in an effort to not fall into realism, because it's not for me, if it's for you, no shade. But in an effort to not get too caught up on the details, especially early on, is that even though I'm working on a computer, I almost never let myself zoom in to get a closer look at what's happening, unless I absolutely need to. Mouse is a little broken. Unless I absolutely need to. For the most part, I will stay as zoomed out if I'm working off of a screen as I possibly can. I think the same would go for if I was working off of like a print piece of reference material. I can try not to blow that image up too much and force myself to just sort of fill in the blanks and interpret that as zoomed out as I can. I feel like that lends itself to a lot more of a fun and sort of abstract iteration.
That's it, Diane, you're in trouble now.
I know, I am.
You worked fine the first half.
Yeah, I was getting a little bit of
Yeah, there's feedback, not real high.
Maybe it's overheating.
no, maybe it's just me.
Maybe if you move it a little.
Put enough blues in there. I'll come back in and really map in my water lilies too. You can start to see, now that that blue is in there, I feel a lot better about that initial olive green color. It feels a lot more aquatic and less like green mud. Actually, a little bit more make sure we get some of these water lilies in here as well. And back to most of them in my tree, so I think I need a little bit more of my teal. Mixing that up. And again, I'm not going for my smallest brush possible here. I'm going to keep my shapes a little vague. Start to map those in there. I'll come back and clean them up later on. Just keeping it kind of expressive at this part. I'll worry about the differences, and there's definitely different colors in there. Some of them are a little bit more on the yellow side, some of them are honestly a little bit more on the brown side. But for the most part, I'm just going to go in with the most obvious color that stands out. And I'll make adjustments to it later. Just want to plot the shapes in. I'll definitely clean these up when I go home too. Let's see. Yeah. It's not in the video. There's a little color variation there. This guy a little bigger, the closer we get, of course. Just putting the floors down, just so I don't completely lose my placement. I'll start with that for my lily pads. Definitely need some more added in. Definitely want to get these leaves that have fallen in the water too, which is an important part of it. Start there, and then I'll take a step back before I start to work back in this darker shadow reflection in my water. I also want to note that even though the first color I was drawn to in this shadow was this dark olive, I'm noticing that a little bit lower is maybe where I need to also push a couple more dark shadows in my reflection. So I'm going to go back into a darker color. So again, even though, like I said, I am somebody who tries for the most part to work as closely with dark to light values in mapping out my scene, I don't force myself to get it exactly right the first time out. I will go back and I'll push things a little bit darker after I've gotten some layers down. And push these values a little bit darker in here. I need to. I think when I was first kind of figuring out my process, I didn't actually necessarily know why it was stated that you should work dark to light. And from my understanding, from having researched it a little bit, that was more so something that was worried about when in oil painting, and then perhaps in the earlier iterations of acrylic painting. It had more to do with how the materials behaved, and now with newer paints, it's not something that you have to worry about quite as much. So it's sort of a rule that's gone by the wayside a bit. You can really, technically now, if you ask me about, what value order do I work in, if you're working in acrylics, this type of acrylic, if it's watercolor, it's kind of a different thing. But with acrylics, for the most part, I just find for the purposes of figuring out in order to work in at all, and where do I start, I try to start with the darkest value that I can identify. If I don't get it exactly right on the first try, I don't worry about it. I'll just adjust after I've gotten some paint on the canvas and go from there. So it's less so like a rule that has to be followed for me and more just where do I start? Starting slightly dark just makes more sense for me. Since that's how I started anyway. Just getting this shadow a little bit darker in here. Using that flat brush. My go-to for my longer fine lines that I'm starting to see a little bit of in my coconut water section. Just standing really quick to make sure my lines are going in the right direction here. I had to learn very quickly at my part-time job at the paint and sip. You know, I have my easel like this the entire time, and you're painting from this angle, and then you'll go in front of your canvas, and everything is like completely skewed, and like nobody's gonna tell me that my tree is falling over. So you have to constantly like, okay, hang on a second. All right, okay, no, I'm on the right track here. It's definitely it's a learned skill in terms of what painting from a diagonal looks like. All right, a couple more diagonals in here. And layering, I found, I always tell anybody that I'm teaching, whether it's that casual setting of paint and sip or more traditional class setting, is that layers are your friend in acrylics. It takes a couple of layers for the paint to look pretty. The first few are just not going to look that great, and that is okay. It's something I've learned to embrace. And it makes it that much more satisfying once you finally get paints to look like something you actually want to call done. Just takes a few tries. Keep darkening up this area a bit. Start to cut into here a bit. Move to the other side of my scene. To make sure I fill in a little bit of work here too. Let's see here. One of the other things I enjoy doing for my shades and my tints is that sometimes I don't like to turn to using just white when I'm trying to create a tint. I have found using Titan Mars Pale and light ultramarine blue as two other sort of shorthands for like a different type of tint than just white. If I'm looking to tint something but maybe keep it on the warmer side, or on the converse, you know, tint something but keep it slightly cool, I will try out one of my other tints that I keep handy. I always put those out as sort of just an extension of my white. So I'm feeling like I want this to be over here, this olive green in my water, where it's not the blue, it's that olive green in there. I feel like throwing in my light ultramarine will tint it and still kind of give it a little bit of the chroma that I'm looking for. And I have it over here. Too much light down there. I'm going to go back to being very general, and then I'll break up the surface of my water later. because it's not quite as bright of a yellow. So I'm not going to worry as much about losing the vibrancy in that area. Be pretty liberal with where I place my paint there. I feel like one of the harder lessons that I have to convey in my part-time job, we also do something that's a little bit more intensive at the paint and sip job, where we do a paint your pet night. So that's a 3-hour class, and we work off of a reference photo, obviously, of the patrons, their pets that they bring in. And I try to delve a little bit deeper into teaching these more traditional paint topics that I'm talking about tonight. And something I tell people, you know, if they were to work on really complicated, complex fur, similar to how there's so many variations in this ripply water surface here, I would have to constantly tell, you know, the students in the class, don't worry about getting every single little detail and a little tiny brush stroke of every ripple of water or every strand of fur right away. Just put something down, something general. And then once you have your first layer, your first shade down, we also try to work dark to light. Once you have something down, it'll dry fast enough that you can go back in and worry about breaking that up with other colors as you see fit. And we don't need to worry just yet about making every surface area of your painting precisely match what is on your reference. You can always go back in and sharpen it up, tighten things up, adjust things as needed. Just put something down. Work general to specific. That's something I'm always harping on. And I'm trying to teach my classes. Just goes such a long way. Break things down a bit. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to lighten this up a little. I'm going to lighten up my blue. I'm just going to go for some white. And I want this to be a more aquatic blue, so again, I'm leaning on my seal. Let's see. I'm just a little bit lighter in here. A slightly darker blue first, and then we'll open it up. I feel like I really enjoy the way those duller, less visually appealing colors, there's that olive green and the browns that I initially was working with, start to have a more aesthetically pleasing part to play in this story. I feel like the blues in my water won't look as beautiful unless they have sort of this murky green to sort of bounce off of. That's why I have this sort of unspoken appreciation for the muted, murkier colors in my scenes. They have an important role to play in making my vibrance and my bright areas really stand out nicely. I'll just reflection, get some of that light in there. Let's see here. Some teal. Keep my tints kind of on the cool side. There's going to be a bright green. Just sort of drag that down for right now, and then we'll worry about these little horizontal brush strokes later. Drag that down. And I want to find a bridge between that super light tint and the darker shade that's next to it, so we're just going to adjust a little bit. Things. Let's see, not that much. I'm just worried about having this look like water. Maybe it's not going to look exactly like my original reference, and that's okay. Not the end of the world for me. Just kind of go off the feeling. Shade that down there, and then play around with this a little bit more. In there. Water, obviously, if anybody's worked with painting water scenes, it's a lot of back and forth trying to weave together a tapestry of colors. So this will take a lot of like back and forth before I kind of feel like everything has melded all together. It's kind of in its place and then locking in nicely with the that are next to it as well. So a little bit more in there. And there. Okay, so with that being said, the last thing I'm going to jump ahead to show. I know a couple of people are already probably familiar with the idea of working front to back and finishing with your sky. But my typical sky mix is, depends on the sky, but I really love to lean into cobalt. I think I sometimes have people ask, like, what is it that you put in your skies that makes it such a vibrant blue? It's usually cobalt, blue, this teal, and one of the ultramarines, either the dark ultramarine, depending if it's a darker sky, or the light ultramarine. So, and then occasionally white, but usually those are my colors. And then once I had more of my leaves done, what I would do if I was to jump ahead a million steps is to go in with my sky back here and would poke through and recreate the rendering and the shapes of your sky from the back. So this is where I would start to get the final iteration of what my tree is going to look like by using the sky behind it to sort of adjust those shapes a little bit. I could maybe, again, be subtracting attractive, if I feel like I painted too many leaves in here, I would just use that sky mix and I can go right back in and reduce how much foliage I placed earlier. The subtractive method. Now the only drawback, you know, I get this question sometimes, and if you are in a similar boat, if you also use this type of technique, is if you have a sunset, you know, a gradient, or you have complicated clouds, there's the hard part, is because you're trying to keep it continuous when you're jumping from area to area. So I do find that that is a unique challenge to using that subtractive method of working your background last. You know, if this was a gradient, a sunset, I would have to try my best with the challenge of acrylics drying fast to try to keep my hues and my shades across my sky the same, as similar as I can, despite where it's kind of poking through, because I don't have that advantage of just working continuously across the surface. So when I do get to my skies, especially if it's the bigger canvas, sometimes I will just get like a completely new piece of palette paper, and I need a lot of surface area and just mix up a ton of paint, get my color mixes established, and then start working so that if I do, you know, lose it, you know, at least I don't have to stop, mix up more paints, things like that. So when I get to my sky and I'm worried about keeping my colors cohesive across the whole surface area, I will take a beat at the very end, get a new piece of palette paper, and make sure I have plenty of my sky colors mixed up ahead of time before I jump into that. Okay, so we have a little over 10 minutes left. I don't know if I wanted to like open it up to any other questions from anybody. Did anybody have anything that came to mind from my rambling or from anything that you saw on the canvas? Anybody has anything? Or, you know, at any point too, if you're free to like wander up here and take a look at things. But essentially, that covers all the major breakdown points of like my supplies, how I start, why I work in the order that I work in, my ethos behind how I approach painting. Anything beyond that, you know, kind of be repetitious. But if anybody has any questions, if you don't want to call them out, you can always come up and ask me questions.
You put, when you're finished, you put a coat over it with anything?
Yes, I do. I do the Golden brand isolation coat, and then I do a spray golden varnish as well.
Okay. What's the isolation coat do?
The isolation coat like permanently seals it in. It's not protective in the same way that a varnish is. Like I usually do a varnish for the purpose of UV protection. That's the main thing for me. But the isolation coat is there in case you need to remove the varnish. Like I've had the misfortune of doing a really poor varnish job. I had to remove it. Luckily it was a water-based varnish. So the isolation coat is there that if you have to do that for any reason, you need to remove the varnish, it doesn't damage the acrylic paints underneath. So very key step in there, for sure. Sometimes I skip it, but it's really ideal to use it. Yes? Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, Chelsea, that I think your presentation has been very helpful in terms of how you prepare the canvas, the wet palette, the idea that we don't have to jump from one color to another, but can use the previous color to mix in the new colors.
Yep.
And it's also been helpful to hear you talking about what you're thinking about as you go step by step. So this has been really very helpful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Do you always work this size, or do you work much larger?
That's a good question. This is typically the size. This is a 12 by 12. I think like a 9 by 12 and 12 by 16 over there. That is the typical range I work in. I have been told in the fine arts community that I need to go bigger, and I have, and I'm done. I'm going bigger. But there's just so many extra things involved. Like, you know, there's the concern of like, will somebody buy such a big painting at such a higher price point? It costs more money to get your prints done. So I do prefer the smaller sizes for sure.
I was gonna ask you if you could transfer the technique that you're doing, does it transfer well to a larger canvas? Or is it that much more effort that, you know, it's obviously gonna take a bit longer than a couple of days when you're working?
Yeah, I think the biggest I've done so far is, I think it was an 18 by 24. So maybe like about the size of that hanging frame over there. And I did some pretty complicated floral scenes similar to the orange one over there. And I think the challenge was my skies. And again, if I had like a sunset gradient or something like that, I had to make sure I mixed up a ton of paint beforehand. And I really I would always underestimate, even with this size, I kept underestimating just how much I needed to have mixed up. Another thing I will say too about the wet palette, I do recommend the smaller size unless you work big. Because anywhere that's not covered with paint will dry out faster. So you'll find that your palette will dry out on just the plain paper. It tends to get a little crusty. So I make sure I cover as much of this with paint as I possibly can. If I were working on a larger surface, I would want more of a palette to work on. I wouldn't worry as much about plain paper getting dried out. But yeah, smaller surfaces are definitely for me. But, yeah, thank you. You're good? Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me. It was a pleasure. If you didn't see, my business cards are